Hello history students, welcome back to our next video on colonial America. So today we're going to start with slave women in the English colonies and talk a little bit about the lives of the African slaves in colonial America. Okay, as I mentioned in my last video, every single European nation that set up colonies in America imported African slaves. The slave trade began in the 1500s, and it was called the Triangle Trade. It was part of an exchange of goods between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Slaves were captured, they were put on ships in Africa, and they were brought to the Americas where they were sold to different colonies as slaves. So we're going to talk in general about the slave experience. Now, it is hard to generalize about the slave experience because it depended on where you were sold and who was your master as to what your experience was. Not all slaves had the same cookie cutter experience. So it's hard to talk in generalities saying all slaves experience this because all slaves may not have experienced different things. So I'll try to generalize as best as I can, but just keep in mind that every slave had a unique experience, just like every person in history has a unique experience. All right, but we're going to be looking at slavery in the English colonies in this class since it's an American history class and we're talking about early America. The English arrived in the Americas in the 1600s. We already covered that in an earlier video. The first servants in the English colonies were people called indentured servants. And indentured servants were, in the beginning, mostly poor Europeans who could not afford to come to the New World but wanted to come and have a new life. But to buy a ticket on a ship and come across the ocean to the Americas was very, very expensive. And average Europeans could not afford to buy a ticket, a passage on a ship. So indentured servant was a way to help poor people in Europe to come to America. And it also served the colonists in America because it brought in cheap labor. So the way indentured servitude worked was someone in America would pay your passage if you were living in Europe, assuming you couldn't pay your own passage. And when you got to America, that person would be technically your employer. And you would have to work for them for between 5 and 7 years. And you signed a contract before you got on the ship agreeing to be someone's servant for whatever it was, 6 years or 7 years. That was a legal contract. So indentured servants were legally bound to work for the person that paid for their fare. And they actually would write up these contracts that would say, Joe Smith will pay the fare of Angela Jones, and Angela agrees to work for him for a period of 5 years, and both parties would sign it. So that was the first means of work in the colonies in the Americas. Now, the first African slaves were brought into the English colonies in the early 1600s. And what we see is by the 1620s, there are less and less people from Europe who are willing to work as an indentured servant. And eventually, indentured servitude gets replaced with African slaves. So let me talk a little bit about the experience of indentured servants, and then we'll talk about how that contrasts to the experience of the African slaves. An indentured servant legally has to work for the person that paid their fare for whatever time period the contract says. Let's say 6 years. So some students ask me, well, what if I came to America and I just left and I said I'm not working? Well, then you have broken a legal contract. You can be arrested and prosecuted for that. Just like if you break any legal contract, there are consequences legally for that. So most indentured servants would not break the contract because they didn't want to be imprisoned. Now, if you're an indentured servant, you had to do the work of your employer Whatever it was. If the employer wanted you to work 8 hours a day in a field working with tobacco plants, that's what you do. If you were assigned to do domestic chores, that's what you did. And you were at the mercy of whoever paid your fare across the ocean. Indentured servants that were women were not usually forced to do manual labor that was deemed man's work in the time period. So, and you're going to hear my puppy moaning and crying in the background. That's going to be probably common in most videos. So, indentured servants who were women typically did domestic work. So a woman indentured servant would have to watch children, do the laundry, cook, prepare food, maintain the fire, what is pretty much what women's work would be. And men who were indentured servants would do more manual labor, may be working in the field or doing manual labor around someone's house. So there were gender roles even in indentured servitude. Indentured servants couldn't run away until their contract was up, and that was it. You had to do what the work was done. Indentured servants were not paid money because they were already paid when they were given their ticket to get on the ship across the ocean. That was their payment. So they are given room and board. You're given food, you're given a place to stay. That's it. You might be given many minor supplies, shoes or something like that, but you're not given a set hourly salary if you're an indentured servant. So you're not going to get wages. Once your contract was fulfilled, once you have worked for X amount of years, let's say you signed a contract for 7 years and the 7 years is up, then you are free. Now, the tradition back in this time was that if you were a good worker, you would get a gift, like a parting gift, and it was to help you kind of in your life. So it might be some tools so that you can start your own business. It might be a piece of land. It might be a little bit of money. But most indentured servants were given a parting gift to kind of thank you for your service. Here, a little something to get you started. So that was what would traditionally happen at the end of your service as a servant, as an indentured servant. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that indentured servitude was not hereditary because it was based on a contract. So if you're a woman and you become an indentured servant, and there were women who were indentured servants who came to America as indentured servants who did household chores. Let's say they got pregnant in the middle of the 5 years they were supposed to work, and they gave birth to a baby. That baby is not a servant because the baby didn't sign the contract. Only the mother signed the contract. So it wasn't hereditary. It didn't pass down to the children. The baby was free. So when the woman was done with her 5 years, she and the baby left, So it was not hereditary. So that's indentured servitude. By the 1620s, though, African slaves started to be imported into the colonies, and African slaves started to replace indentured servants. Part of the reason is that there were fewer and fewer Europeans who wanted to come and become an indentured servant. All right, so let's talk about the African slave experience in the English colonies. Men and women who were slaves had a different experience. Now, one of the things I also want to mention before I move into this topic is that the first African slaves that were brought into the English colonies, there's a lot of mystery about those first African slaves. There aren't any records about what happened to those particular people when they came into the colonies. So a lot of historians assume that those first shipment of African slaves were treated as indentured servants because that was the system that existed in the English colonies, meaning that some of them might have worked for X amount of years and been freed. Now, that is a theory that many, many historians believe. Again, do we know for sure? No, because there are no records of the very first slaves that came in. But what we do know, if you look at colonial law, is that the colonial laws began to change pretty early on regarding African slaves. And I'll take Virginia for example. The colony of Virginia began to pass laws in the early 1600s taking away the rights and freedoms of the African slaves and turning African slaves into what we call chattel slavery. I'll put that on the outline. So African slaves eventually became chattel slaves. Chattel means movable property. So even though African slaves may have been treated more like indentured servants in the beginning, in a few years, colonial laws changed, stripping them of rights and freedoms, turning African slaves into chattel slaves. And chattel slavery became a lifetime slavery situation. It wasn't limited like the indentured servitude. And it was hereditary. So we'll talk about that too. But let's talk about gender differences first, because men and women were enslaved in the English colonies, but they didn't have the exact same experience because of their gender. Now, there are similarities, though. There are shared experiences that men and women had. So let me go over some of those first, then we'll talk about the differences. Shared experiences. Number one, they had no legal control over their lives. Because they were considered slaves, you're not considered a citizen. Number two, they had to do the work the owners, their masters, demanded. So if your master says you're working 10 hours a day in the fields, that's what you did. You have to work on your master's demands. Both men and women could be brutally punished, including corporal punishment, meaning being whipped, physical abuse. Both men and women could be separated from their family. Your husband, kids, parents could be sold away at any time. You had no say over that. And both men and women had to accept marginal clothing and food from the owners. They were not given anything else. Obviously, they're not paid, they're slaves. So there are similarities in the slave experience for men and women. And one thing I want to mention about the brutal punishment and the corporal punishment. Indentured servants were not allowed to be beaten or have physical abuse. That was not permitted in indentured servitude. Part of it is that indentured servants were considered citizens of the colony, and so they could not be physically abused. However, colonial laws, like in Virginia, specifically said that corporal punishment of slaves was acceptable, slaves from Africa. So physical abuse of the slaves was written into law as acceptable, but not allowed for white indentured servants. All right, let's look at the differences, because women and men do have some differences in their slave experience. Number one, women do reproductive work, meaning women are the ones who are the child bearers. They're the ones who have to nurture the children in their early years. A lot of times women did the child rearing alone without the help of the husbands and fathers, because in many instances slaves were separated by gender. Men were required to live in separate quarters from women and the children, and especially in the early years of American slavery. His responsibility not only for childbearing but for child rearing, primarily. Now, after many years, slave owners began to realize the economic value of women's procreative ability. African slavery in the English colonies became hereditary. And so slave owners started to realize that they wanted to protect and encourage the slaves to procreate, and they wanted to protect the pregnancies of their slaves, because the more children that are born, that's extra slaves for the master to own. So by the mid 1700s, most slave owners realized the potential benefits of reproduction of their slaves. And this is especially true after the year 1807, because after 1807, Congress outlawed the overseas slave trade. So that meant there would be no more slaves coming in from Africa, and that raised the price of slaves. And the best way to add to your slaves without spending money was to have the slaves you already owned procreate. So slave owners became more concerned with the reproductive abilities of their slave women after 1807. So the pregnancies of female slaves became very, very important especially after 1807. All right, let's look at the family life of the African slaves in the English colonies. Historians look back at slave culture and they believe that slave women were the centers of the slave family life. Slave families are not the typical nuclear families that we think of today. Slave families often had a one-parent household. Oftentimes, again, the mother would be separate from the husband. Or there would be a group of people who acted like family that were actually not blood related to each other, but they called each other family names. In the English colonies, slaves were not allowed to marry legally. So slaves did not have formal marriages and formal family units that white colonists had. And now, that doesn't mean that slaves did not informally marry and build their own family lives. Yes, they did. There are slaves that created their own ceremonies to signify marriage, even if it wasn't legally allowed in the colony they lived in. One example is jumping the broom, which was a ceremony to signify marriage commitment, where a slave couple would step over a broom to kind of signify they were committing to each other. On a large plantation where there were many slaves, the slave communities viewed themselves as one big extended family. And oftentimes slaves would call each other aunt, uncle, cousin, sister, even if they weren't blood related, because they saw each other as a big extended family. It was a community. Slaves built their own communities and culture, even though they were not viewed as legal citizens of the colony they lived in. And historians believe mothers were the center of these communities. So, and again, part of it is that mothers had much more time with their children often than fathers did, because the children remain with the mother, not with the father, in most instances. Again, talking in generalities, not every slave had the same exact experience, but depended on the owner. All right, let's look at resistance now. Gender seems to impact slave resistance. Historians have studied fugitive slaves in U.S. history. Running away is the biggest form of resistance you can do as a slave. And there's something interesting that historians have found when they look at runaway slaves in colonial America. I'll give you an example, and I'm never going to ask you this again. This is just, just to give you an idea. In the 1730s in South Carolina, 77% of the advertised runaway slaves were men, male slaves. In the Williamsburg, Richmond, Fredericksburg, Virginia area, 1736 to 1801, there were 1,138 slaves advertised as running away. Out of that number, only 142 were women. And that pattern repeats over and over and over. When you look at the advertised runaway slaves, the advertisements are primarily for male runaway slaves, not women. Now, one thing I want to mention is that if your slave ran away, the government, even in colonial America, didn't get involved in helping you recover your runaway slave. So what slave owners would do is they would take out advertisements to try to capture the slave and offer a reward. And oftentimes they had an idea of where the slave would run to. A lot of times slaves were running away to reunite with family. And if the owner, the master, knew where the family member had been sent, oftentimes they would advertise in that area and try to recover their runaway slave that way. So the question is, why are there so few advertisements for women running away? Why does it seem like men ran away more than women did? The average age of the runaway slaves in this time period was between the ages of 16 and 35 years old. What's that age for women, 16 to 35? That's the childbearing age of women. So Slave women of that age are either pregnant or they have babies or they're raising small children, which makes it much more difficult to run away. When you run away, you have to go out into danger. And in many instances, you have to hide. You have to be quiet. You have to go at night. That's very difficult to do with a baby or a toddler. How do you tell a toddler we're hiding today? Be quiet. It's impossible. So to run away with small children or infants is impossible. You'll get caught. So that's probably why more men ran away than women did. Slave men may have run away more because maybe they had crueler treatment, maybe they had more corporal punishment, maybe they had long hours of labor, maybe they were free to run away because they didn't have the responsibility of the babies and the children. So, those possible reasons why men ran away more than women did. Also, by the mid 1700s, slave owners became more lenient on slave women because of their reproductive value. So maybe women, some historians say, well, maybe women had less reason to run away because they weren't as harshly treated because the masters wanted to preserve their ability to bear children. There are men slaves who ran away because of cruel treatment, because of fear of sale of loved ones. And that can be true of women too. I'm not saying women never ran away. There are women slaves that ran away. There are women who were desperate enough to run away with children. Sometimes a woman might hear that her child was going to be sold away. You have no legal rights to your children as a slave. So there are slave women who may have desperately ran away with the child, trying to prevent them from being sold away from them. Um, that might mean also leaving other children behind, by the way. You might not be able to take all your children with you. There's an old story about a Maryland slave mother named Vina, who was forced to choose. She had 4 children. She wanted to run away, but she knew she couldn't. The odds of running away with 4 children, the odds of getting away were slim. She had 2 daughters and 2 sons. And she chose to run away with her daughters and left her sons behind because she felt her sons were stronger to kind of deal with the wrath of the master after he found out she ran away. So that was a tough choice some slaves had to make too, is maybe I run away with some children and not all my children. But that is a form of resistance, is running away, that we see men do a lot more than women. There are other forms of resistance, though, besides running away. We don't see in American history a lot of massive slave revolts like you see in other areas of the world. Part of it is that slaves in the English colonies and later on in the US were watched very carefully, and it would have been very difficult for them to organize a massive slave revolt. So American slaves in the American colonies and later in the US found indirect ways of resistance rather than having a massive slave revolt. Breaking equipment is resistance. Faking an illness is resistance. One form of resistance that women were more likely to be accused of than men was poisoning the master or the master's family. Now think about it. That makes sense because mostly it was women slaves that worked in the home, cooking and cleaning and doing household chores. Domestic slaves were mainly women because they were doing women's work, what was deemed women's work back then. So they had more of an opportunity to poison the master if they wanted to. And there were women slaves that were accused of poisoning the master. In 1755, in Charleston, South Carolina, there was a slave woman who was burned at the stake for poisoning her master. Now, I do wonder, and this is just my personal curiosity, but I do wonder how many slave women were falsely accused of poisoning their master when what really happened was food poisoning. Because there's no electricity back then. How difficult was it to keep food preserved? And it probably was common to get food poisoning because they didn't have refrigeration. And so, how many times did a family member get sick and they thought it was poisoning when it was really simply food poisoning? So I do wonder if the poor women who were accused of poisoning a master's family were falsely accused because of that. Another form of resistance is faking illness. Women could do that more often than men because childbearing became the number one expectation masters had of women. And again, the masters, especially after 1807, wanted to protect the childbearing ability of their slaves because that meant more slaves for them. So women could say they were ill and claim it was because of pregnancy and get away with it. Men can't do that. So men wouldn't be able to fake illness as well as women can. I'm going to tell you a little story about President James Polk, who was a slave owner. He had a plantation, and when he went to Washington, D.C. to be president, he had an overseer who managed the slaves, managed the plantation for him while he was away. And he sent lots of letters to this manager to talk about the business of the plantation. In those letters, there are references to a slave that Polk owned named Maria. And the manager was writing letters to the president saying, "Oh, Maria is always ill. She can't go in the fields and work. She says she's in pain. She says that she's ill. She's too sick to go. She can't handle the work and the heat." So finally, the president and the manager decide in these letters, move her in the house and teach her how to weave. Give her a different job. And miraculously, after they moved her into the house, suddenly all her illnesses disappeared and she became a great weaver. So historians look at those letters, and they wonder, was the slave Maria really ill? We don't know for sure, but faking illness was a way to get out of work. That is a form of resistance. So was Maria really ill, or was she saying she was ill because she really wanted to work in the house? We'll never know because Maria didn't leave any records. The male and female slave experiences, I wouldn't say female slaves had it better or worse than men. It was just different. Women slaves were more confined to the plantation because of children. Um, Women could fake illness more than men. Women had less opportunity to run away than men because they were either pregnant or dealing with childcare. Now, sexual abuse. Let's talk about that for a minute. Historians believe that women were more susceptible to sexual abuse than men. That doesn't mean male slaves weren't sexually abused, because I'm sure they were. But historians believe that more women slaves had to deal with sexual abuse than male slaves did. So I want to tell you the story of Harriet Jacobs. Probably in the next video I'll do Phyllis Wheatley. We'll see. Harriet Jacobs was born around 1815 and she died around 1897. And her story is going to reveal the issue of sexual harassment for slave women. Image of Harriet Jacobs, but this is a marker that represents Harriet Jacobs in Eden, where she was born, Edenton, North Carolina. Harriet Jacobs was born a slave in North Carolina around 1815, I think 1815, maybe 1813. In her early life, she wrote later that she was happy until her mother died when she was about 6 years old. Then she moved into the home of the slave owner, and she was taught to sew and she was taught to read. As a young teen, she was made the slave of a Dr. James Norcom. And Dr. Norcom begins to pressure Harriet Jacobs to start a sexual relationship with him. And she resists him. One of the things he does is he starts plotting, and he starts telling her of his plans of how he's going to make her his sexual slave, pretty much. And she begins a relationship with a neighbor who was a free man. And when she got pregnant by her boyfriend, Dr. Norcom got very angry. And she ended up having 2 kids with her boyfriend. And Dr. Norcom was so angry he was threatening to sell away her kids. Because the way that slavery worked was you were a slave if your mother was a slave. It doesn't matter that your father's free. It doesn't matter who your father is. The way that slavery worked was that if your mother was enslaved, so are you. So even though Harriet was having children with her lover, her boyfriend, who was free, that didn't matter. Her children were owned by Dr. Norcom. And so she was terrified that he was going to sell her children away from her. So she ran away in 1835. And she hides in the home of her grandmother, who was a freed slave. And she hid for several years in the attic. And eventually, her boyfriend bought his kids from Dr. Norcom and they became free. And eventually, Harriet Jacobs escapes in 1842 to Pennsylvania, and later she comes to New York, and she joined the anti-slavery movement in the North. And in 1861, she published her autobiography. And her book was called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. That autobiography was published in 1861, same year the Civil War began. In that book, Harriet Jacobs openly discusses the sexual harassment she endured as a slave from Dr. Norcom. She changed his name in the book to Dr. Flint. So she talks about this Dr. Flint. She's really talking about Dr. Norcom. That subject of sexual harassment, sexual abuse of slaves was shocking to the anti-slavery movement in the North because sexual abuse wasn't discussed back then. And for Harriet Jacobs to publish a book where she openly discusses sexual harassment that she experienced as a slave was shocking and horrifying, and it gave more fuel to the anti-slavery movement. One of the things that Harriet Jacobs said in the book was about how she felt when she gave birth to her daughter. And here's a quote from Harriet Jacobs. She said, "When they told me my newborn babe was a girl, my heart was heavier than it had ever been before. Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women, because women deal with sexual abuse." That's why she wrote that quote, because she was dealing with sexual abuse. And again, I'm not saying men were never sexually abused as slaves. I'm sure they were. But probably more instances of women being sexually abused than men were. So that book was important because it brought to life a new horror of slavery that people really weren't talking about at the time. And it brought more fuel to the anti-slavery movement. So that is, again, another difference in the slave experience between men and women. That women probably had to deal with sexual abuse more often than men did. So that's where I'm going to leave it. Next lecture, we will talk about Phyllis Wheatley. So I'll see you then.